The sun was setting over Interstate 80 as Mike Donovan guided his 18-wheeler into the dusty parking lot of the Last Stop Diner. Located just outside Elko, Nevada, this truck stop was a familiar landmark for drivers making the long haul across the western states. Mike had been on the road for 14 hours straight, and his large frame ached from being confined to the driver's seat for so long. At 48 years old and carrying nearly 300 pounds on his 6'2" frame, Mike wasn't the picture of fitness. His beard was flecked with gray, and his plaid shirt stretched tight across his belly. Most people who saw him assumed he was just another overweight, aging trucker who spent too many hours sitting and eating greasy diner food. Mike parked his rig in the back of the lot, taking his time as he climbed down from the cab. His knees protested with each step of the descent. He grabbed his worn trucker cap from the passenger seat and adjusted it over his thinning hair before heading toward the diner's entrance. The neon sign of the Last Stop Diner flickered against the darkening sky. Mike noticed a row of motorcycles parked near the entrance. 5 gleaming machines with custom paint jobs and chrome that caught the last rays of sunlight. The sight made him pause briefly. In his 20 years on the road, he learned that where there were bikes, there were often bikers, and not all of them were the friendly weekend rider type. Still, Mike was hungry and needed coffee if he was going to make it to Salt Lake City by morning. He continued toward the entrance, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel. Inside, the diner was just as Mike remembered it: red vinyl booths, a long counter with spinning stools, and the smell of coffee and fried food filling the air. What was different tonight was the noise. Near the counter, 5 men in leather vests were laughing loudly, their voices drowning out the country music playing from the jukebox in the corner. The waitress behind the counter, her name tag read Darlene, gave Mike a tired smile as he entered. "Sit anywhere you like, honey," she called out, her voice barely audible over the rowdy group. Mike chose a booth far from the bikers, settling his bulk onto the vinyl seat with a sigh of relief. You could see the group clearly now. Each of their leather vests displayed a scorpion patch with the words "Desert Scorpions" curved above it. They were drinking beer despite the no alcohol sign behind the counter, and Darlene seemed too intimidated to enforce the rule. One of the bikers, a tall, lean man with a shaved head and a snake tattoo coiling up his neck, noticed Mike looking their way. He nudged his companions and nodded in the trucker's direction. Their laughter quieted as they all turned to stare at Mike. Mike looked down at his menu, not wanting trouble. Years on the road had taught him when to keep his head down. He ordered coffee and a burger when Darlene came by, speaking quietly so his voice wouldn't carry across the room. But the damage was done. The bikers had noticed him, and something about Mike, maybe his size, maybe the way he'd looked at them, had caught their attention. The tattooed man whispered something to his friends, and fresh laughter erupted from the group, louder than before. Mike sipped his coffee when it arrived, feeling the weight of their stares on his back. The night had just begun, and Mike had the sinking feeling that his peaceful dinner stop was about to become anything but peaceful. Mike tried to focus on his meal when it arrived. The burger was decent. Not the best he'd had on the road, but far from the worst. He kept his head down, hoping the bikers would lose interest and go back to their own conversations. But the prickly feeling between his shoulder blades told him he wasn't going to be that lucky tonight. Sure enough, the scrape of bar stools against the linoleum floor announced that at least some of the group was on the move. Mike didn't look up until a shadow fell across his table. The tattooed man stood there, flanked by 2 others. Up close, Mike could see that the snake tattoo on his neck had red eyes that matched the man's bloodshot ones. Well, the tattooed man said, his voice carrying a slight slur. "What do we have here? Looks like a big boy eating a big meal." Mike set his burger down and wiped his mouth with a napkin. He stayed quiet, assessing the situation. 3 by the table, 2 still at the counter. The tattooed man was clearly the leader. The diner had emptied out in the last few minutes, with the only other customers, an elderly couple, having hurriedly paid their bill and left when the bikers started moving around. "Not feeling friendly tonight, big guy?" one of the other bikers asked. This one wore a grazy bandana around his head and had a patchy beard. "Cat got your tum, or just too busy stuffing your face?" The third man, shorter but heavily muscled with a scar running through one eyebrow, laughed and reached over to grab a handful of Mike's fries. "Don't mind if I do. You look like you've had enough food anyway, fatso." Mike took a deep breath. 20 years ago, he would have already been on his feet at the first insult. But he had learned patience over the years, sometimes the hard way. Gentlemen, he said calmly, I'm just trying to have my dinner in peace. I don't want any trouble. This response seemed to amuse the bikers even more. The tattooed leader leaned in closer, his breath reeking of beer and cigarettes. Hear that, boys? The big man doesn't want trouble. He reached out and poked Mike's shoulder hard. But maybe trouble wants you, big man. Darlene watched nervously from behind the counter, her hand hovering near the phone. The remaining two bikers were now also getting up from their stools. Look, Mike said, still keeping his voice level, I've got a long haul ahead of me tonight. Why don't I pay for my meal and you fellows can get back to your evening? Why don't you make us? The bandana-wearing biker challenged, leaning in so close that Mike could count the missing teeth in his snarl. The leader, clearly enjoying himself, suddenly grabbed Mike's coffee cup and dumped what remained of it right onto Mike's plate, ruining his half-eaten burger. Oops, he said with mock concern. Look what happened to your dinner. Guess you'll have to order something else now. The bikers all laughed as coffee dripped from the table onto Mike's jeans. Mike closed his eyes for a moment. Images flashed through his mind. Memories he tried to keep buried for years. The sound of helicopter rotors. The weight of a rifle in his hands. The 8 years he'd spent as a Marine before taking to the road. When Mike opened his eyes again, something had changed in them. The tired trucker look was gone, replaced by a focused intensity that made the tattooed leader take a small step back. I'll say this one more time, Mike said, his voice now carrying a different kind of authority. I don't want any trouble. But it was already too late for that. The bikers had made their choice, and now they were about to learn why it was the wrong one. The tattooed leader recovered quickly from his moment of uncertainty, not wanting to lose face in front of his crew. He leaned in closer to Mike, his snake tattoo seeming to writhe with the movement of his neck muscles. You know what, fat boy? I think it's time for you to leave. But first, he reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a switchblade, flicking it open with practiced ease. Maybe we should help you lose some weight. The other bikers grinned, forming a tighter circle around Mike's booth. The short one with the scarred eyebrow pulled out a set of brass knuckles, sliding them onto his thick fingers. Darlene finally found her courage. I'm calling the police, she shouted from behind the counter, already dialing the phone. Hang that up, the bandana-wearing biker yelled, pointing at her. This ain't your business. The distraction gave Mike the moment he needed. In one fluid motion that belied his size, he slid out of the booth and to his feet. The bikers, expecting the slow, awkward movements of an overweight truck driver, were caught off guard by his speed. Last chance to walk away, Mike said quietly, now standing at his full height. Even the tattooed leader had to look up to meet his eyes. The leader sneered and brandished his knife. You think we're scared of some fat trucker? There's 5 of us and 1 of you. Those ain't good odds, big man. A small, grim smile appeared on Mike's face. I've had worse. When the leader lunged with his knife, Mike moved with the precision of someone who had trained for years to handle exactly this kind of situation. He stepped to the side, caught the man's wrist, and twisted. The crack of bone was audible throughout the diner, followed immediately by the leader's scream of pain as the knife clattered to the floor. The other bikers froze for just a second that proved costly. Mike drove his massive fist into the stomach of the biker with brass knuckles, lifting the shorter man off his feet with the force of the blow. As that man doubled over, struggling to breathe, Mike pivoted and delivered an elbow strike to the temple of the bandana-wearing biker, who crumpled to the floor without a sound. The 2 bikers who had been at the counter rushed forward now, one of them grabbing a chair to use as a weapon. Mike kicked the leader's fallen knife under a nearby table, then positioned himself with his back to the wall. He broke Razor's arm. One of them shouted, referring to their fallen leader who was now on his knees, cradling his twisted wrist. The biker with the chair swung it wildly at Mike. Years of boxing training kicked in, and Mike blocked the swing with his forearm, then countered with a right hook that connected solidly with the man's jaw. The biker staggered, dazed but still standing. The last standing biker, seeing how quickly the odds had changed, pulled out a small canister of pepper spray. Stay back, man, he warned, his hand shaking. Mike assessed the situation with the calm of someone who had been in far worse circumstances. The leader, Razor, was incapacitated. The bandana wearer was unconscious. The short one was still gasping for breath on the floor. One was dazed and unsteady on his feet, and one was pointing pepper spray with a trembling hand. from bad odds to good ones in less than a minute. Drop it, Mike commanded, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone used to giving orders that were obeyed. You broke his arm, man. You're crazy. The biker with the pepper spray shouted, backing toward the door. Mike took a step forward. I said, drop it. Now. The sound of sirens in the distance signaled that Darlene had succeeded in calling the police. The biker looked from Mike to his injured friends, then to the door, clearly calculating his chances of escape. What he saw in Mike's eyes made the decision for him. He slowly lowered the pepper spray and set it on a nearby table. This isn't over, he muttered. There was no conviction in his voice. Mike's expression didn't change. Yes, he said calmly. It is. The wail of police sirens grew louder as two county sheriff cars pulled into the truck stop parking lot, lights flashing against the growing darkness outside. Through the diner's windows, Mike could see the officers approaching cautiously, hands near their holsters. Inside, the situation had reached a tense standstill. Razor remained on his knees, face pale with pain as he clutched his broken wrist. The bandana-wearing biker was still out cold on the floor, while the short one with the scarred eyebrow had managed to get to his feet, but was leaning heavily against a table, struggling to catch his breath. The other two stood uncertain and shaken, all their earlier bravado gone. The front door swung open, and two officers entered with hands on their weapons, quickly scanning the scene. Everyone freeze. The taller officer commanded. Hands where we can see them. Mike slowly raised his hands, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. The conscious bikers did the same, except for Razor, who could only raise one arm. That's him, officers. Darlene called from behind the counter, pointing at Mike. But he was just defending himself. These men attacked him first. The officers looked skeptical, taking in Mike's size versus the smaller bikers. The second officer, an older man with graying hair at his temples, stepped forward. All right, everyone sit down and stay put. We're going to sort this out. As the officers separated people for questioning, Darlene produced the diner's security camera footage. Mike sat alone at a table, his dinner ruined, watching as the officers reviewed the video on a small screen behind the counter. Their expressions changed as they saw the entire incident unfold exactly as it had happened. The older officer approached Mike after viewing the footage. Sir, can I see some ID, please? Mike carefully reached for his wallet and handed over his driver's license. The officer studied it, then looked back at Mike with new interest. Michael Donovan, he read aloud. 20 years commercial driving experience, clean record. He paused, studying Mike's face. But that's not the whole story, is it, Mr. Donovan? Those weren't the moves of just a truck driver. Mike sighed deeply. That was a long time ago, officer. Marine? The officer guessed. Mike nodded. 8 years. Force recon. Got out in 2005. The officer handed back the license. Thought so. My brother was force recon. Nobody moves like that without serious training. He gestured to the bikers, who were now being attended to by paramedics who had just arrived. These boys had no idea of who they were messing with, did they? I tried to warn them, Mike said simply. Meanwhile, the paramedics were examining Razor's wrist. Clean break, one of them announced. Looks like it was done with precision, almost surgical. How exactly did this happen? Before Razor could answer, the short biker with the scarred eyebrow spoke up, his voice still raspy from the blow to his stomach. Man, you should have seen it. We thought he was just some fat trucker, but he moved like nothing I've ever seen. 1 minute Razor's got a knife on him, the next minute Razor's on the ground screaming. The tall officer was searching the biker's saddlebags and had discovered a disturbing collection of items. Well, what do we have here? Drugs, more weapons, and... He pulled out a small notebook, what looks like a list of truck stops and dates. He flipped through the pages. Sergeant, I think we just caught the gang that's been robbing truckers up and down I-80. The older officer looked at Mike. Seems like you did us all a favor tonight, Mr. Donovan. Razor, now with his wrist in a temporary splint, glared at Mike with a mixture of pain and hatred. You broke my wrist, you fat. I could have done a lot worse, Mike interrupted calmly. Where I trained, they taught us 17 ways to disarm a knife attacker. 16 of them end with the attacker dead. He paused, letting that sink in. I chose the 17th. The diner fell silent as everyone, including the officers, took in the full meaning of Mike's words. The bikers looked at him with new understanding and a healthy dose of fear. This wasn't just some lucky punch thrown by an ordinary trucker. They had unknowingly picked a fight with a highly trained combat veteran, and they had paid the price for their mistake. As the paramedics continued treating the injured bikers, the sergeant pulled Mike aside for a more detailed statement. They sat in a quiet corner booth while the tall officer supervised the handcuffing of the two uninjured gang members. "Mr. Donovan," the sergeant began, flipping open a small notepad, "I'd like to hear your version of events from the beginning." Mike rubbed his large hands together, the knuckles on his right hand already starting to swell. "Not much to tell that you haven't seen on the video. I stopped for dinner, they started harassing me, things escalated when the one they call Razor pulled a knife." The sergeant nodded, jotting notes. "And the combat training you mentioned, Force Recon, was it?" "Yes, sir. Served from 1997 to 2005. Did 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq." Mike's voice remained matter-of-fact, but his eyes took on a distant look. "After that, I just wanted a quiet life. Trucking lets me be alone with my thoughts." "Until tonight," the sergeant observed. Mike nodded, a hint of sadness crossing his face. "Until tonight." Across the diner, Razor was arguing with the paramedic who was trying to stabilize his wrist. "Get your hands off me. I know my rights. I want to press charges against that fat trucker." The sergeant glanced over and shook his head. "Not sure that's going to work out how he thinks." He turned back to Mike. "I have to ask. When you took down these 5 men, were you concerned for your safety at any point?" Mike considered the question seriously. "Not really. Once the leader pulled the knife, training just kicked in. It's like riding a bike. Your body remembers even when your mind wants to forget." The front door of the diner opened, and a slender woman in civilian clothes entered, showing a badge to the officer at the door. She headed straight for the sergeant, who stood to greet her. "Agent Calloway, FBI," she introduced herself to Mike before turning to the sergeant. "We've been tracking the Desert Scorpions for months. They're suspected in a string of truck stop robberies across 3 states, along with drug trafficking and assault." She studied Mike with professional curiosity. "You're the truck driver who took them down." Mike shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "Just defended myself, ma'am." Agent Calloway turned to the sergeant. "I'd like access to that security footage for our investigation." Then back to Mike. "And I'd appreciate a full statement from you, Mr. Donovan." Meanwhile, the paramedics had moved on to examining the still unconscious bandana-wearing biker. "This one needs a hospital," one of them announced. "Possible concussion." The short biker with the scarred eyebrow, now handcuffed and sitting at the counter, shook his head in disbelief. "Man, Blade ain't woken up yet. What did you hit him with?" "My elbow," Mike answered simply. The biker stared at him. "Just your elbow? Dan." Agent Calloway pulled up a chair across from Mike. "Mr. Donovan, these men have been terrorizing truckers for months. Most victims were too afraid to come forward. Those who did reported being beaten, robbed, and threatened with death if they went to the police." Mike's expression hardened slightly. "They picked the wrong trucker tonight." "They certainly did." Agent Calloway agreed. She leaned forward. "Force Recon Marine, the sergeant tells me." Mike nodded. "And a heavyweight boxer during your service years," she added, surprising Mike. "I just ran your name through our database. 3-time All-Marine boxing champion, 2000 to 2002. Mike looked down at his swollen knuckles. That was a lifetime ago. The biker who had tried to use pepper spray was being led past their table in handcuffs. He stopped and looked at Mike with a mixture of fear and respect. "Who are you, man?" he asked. "For real?" Mike met his gaze steadily. "Just a trucker who wanted to eat his dinner in peace." The officer pulled the biker along, but the man looked back over his shoulder. "You guys should have seen it," he called to Agent Calloway. "Biggest guy I ever saw move that fast, like some kind of, I don't know what." As the biker was led away, Agent Calloway studied Mike with new interest. "Seems you made quite an impression, Mr. Donovan." Mike shrugged his massive shoulders. "Not the kind I usually aim for." Outside, more police cars had arrived, their lights painting the parking lot in pulses of red and blue. What had started as a simple dinner stop had turned into something much more complicated. And for Mike Donovan, the quiet anonymity he had cultivated for years on the road had just been shattered in a matter of minutes. The paramedics had finally stabilized Razor's wrist and were preparing to transport him to the hospital. Despite his injury, Razor couldn't stop staring at Mike from across the diner. The hatred in his eyes had gradually transformed into something else, a dawning realization of just how badly he and his gang had miscalculated. Agent Calloway continued interviewing Mike while officers processed the scene. Darlene brought over fresh coffee for both of them, refusing Mike's offer to pay for it. On the house, she insisted. After what these thugs have been doing to folks around here, someone needed to teach them a lesson. She patted Mike's shoulder before returning to the counter. As officers led the last conscious and uninjured biker toward the door, Razor called out from his stretcher. "Wait!" His voice was strained, his face pale with pain. "I need to talk to him." He nodded toward Mike. The officers looked at Agent Calloway, who considered for a moment, then nodded. They wheeled Razor's stretcher closer to Mike's table, but kept a careful distance. Razor's tough facade had crumbled completely. His eyes darted nervously from Mike's massive hands to his impassive face. "Look, man," Razor began, his voice barely above a whisper. "We didn't know. We thought you were just..." He struggled to find the words. "Just a fat trucker?" Mike supplied, his voice neutral. Razor swallowed hard and nodded. "You gotta understand, we're not. We didn't mean to." "To what?" Agent Calloway interjected. "Didn't mean to rob him like you've robbed dozens of other truckers. Didn't mean to assault him with a deadly weapon." Razor's eyes widened. "How did you know about the others?" Agent Calloway smiled thinly. "We've been building a case against your gang for months. Tonight just speeds things up considerably." Razor looked back at Mike, desperation clear in his eyes. "Listen, I know we messed up bad, but you gotta help me out here. Tell them it wasn't that serious. Tell them I didn't really mean to use the knife." Mike studied the biker leader, seeing not the threatening figure from earlier, but a scared man facing the consequences of his choices. "You pulled a knife on me," he stated firmly. "You threatened me with it. You intended to use it." "I was just trying to scare you." Razor protested, his voice rising. "Please, man, they're talking about armed assault charges. With my record, that's 10 years minimum." "Should have thought about that before you pulled the knife," the sergeant commented from nearby. Razor's desperate eyes stayed locked on Mike. "Please," he begged, all traces of his earlier swagger gone. "I got a kid. She's 8. 10 years and I'll miss everything." For the first time, Mike's impassive expression softened slightly. The mention of a child had touched something in him. "I can't lie about what happened," Mike said firmly. "You threatened me with a knife. That's the truth." Razor's face fell. But Mike continued, looking at Agent Calloway. "He didn't actually stab me or slash at me. He threatened. I defended myself. That's all." Agent Calloway nodded, understanding what Mike was doing. He wasn't going to lie, but he wasn't going to exaggerate either. "Please," Razor continued, growing more desperate as the paramedics prepared to wheel him away. "I'm begging you. We all are." He looked around at his fellow gang members, who nodded vigorously. "We made a terrible mistake. We picked the wrong guy. We'll never do anything like this again." The short biker with the scarred eyebrow spoke up from where he sat handcuffed. "He's right, man. We learned our lesson. You broke Razor's wrist like it was nothing. You knocked Blade out cold with just your elbow. We'd be crazy to ever mess with anyone again after this." Mike looked at each of the bikers in turn, seeing genuine fear in their eyes. The tough, intimidating gang that had surrounded his table less than an hour ago was now reduced to a group of frightened men begging for mercy from the very person they had targeted. "I'll tell the truth," Mike repeated firmly. "Nothing more, nothing less." As the paramedics finally wheeled Razor toward the door, the biker leader locked eyes with Mike one last time. "I'm sorry," he said, the words clearly unfamiliar in his mouth. "I'm really, really sorry." Mike didn't respond, simply watching as the man who had threatened him with a knife was taken away, his gang's reign of terror along the interstate brought to an abrupt end by the fat trucker that had so fatally underestimated. 2 hours after the confrontation, the last stop diner had transformed from crime scene back to restaurant. The police had taken their statements, collected evidence, and departed with the handcuffed bikers. Only Mike, Darlene, and a few curious locals who had heard about the incident remained. Mike sat at the counter now, finally eating a fresh meal that Darlene had insisted on making him after his first dinner was ruined. She'd made it special, a double cheeseburger with extra bacon, a mountain of fries, and a chocolate shake on the side. Eat up, she encouraged, sliding the plate in front of him. After taking down 5 bikers, you've earned every calorie. Mike smiled slightly and took a bite of his burger. His right hand was wrapped in an ice pack that one of the paramedics had given him before leaving. Though he hadn't mentioned it to anyone, his old boxing injuries were flaring up, the price of using skills he hadn't called upon in years. The bell above the diner door jingled, and Mike glanced up to see Agent Calloway returning. She'd left an hour earlier with the last of the officers but had promised to return with updates. Mr. Donovan, she greeted, sliding onto the stool beside him. Still here, I see. Needed to eat, Mike replied simply. And my driving hours are up for the day anyway. I'll sleep in my truck tonight, head out in the morning. Agent Calloway nodded. I wanted to let you know that we've confirmed these men were responsible for at least 12 robberies at truck stops across Nevada, Utah, and Idaho over the past 6 months. 2 truckers were hospitalized with serious injuries. Mike paused mid-bite, setting his burger down. Anyone die? No, thankfully, but it could have happened eventually. They were escalating, getting more violent with each robbery. She studied Mike's face. You may have saved lives tonight, Mr. Donovan, not just your own. Mike shrugged uncomfortably at the praise. Just defended myself. And did it remarkably well. Agent Calloway accepted the coffee Darlene offered her. Razor, real name Dale Mercer, has been wanted for parole violations for over a year. They'll be going away for a long time. He mentioned having a daughter, Mike said quietly. Agent Calloway's expression softened slightly. Yes, he does. She lives with her mother in Reno. From what we can tell, he hasn't seen her in 3 years, despite what he implied to you. Mike nodded, absorbing this information. He wasn't surprised, but it still saddened him to think of a child growing up without her father, even if that father was a criminal. What happens now? Mike asked. For them, processing, charges, eventual trial, though most will likely take plea deals. For you? Agent Calloway smiled slightly. You go back to your life. Though I have to say, after watching that security footage, the FBI could use someone with your skills. Mike shook his head firmly. Those days are behind me. I chose trucking for a reason. The solitude. The peace. Mike corrected her. Or at least, the chance to find some. The diner had grown quiet as other customers left. Only the soft sounds of Darlene wiping down tables and the quiet country music from the jukebox filled the space. Agent Calloway finished her coffee and stood to leave. Well, Mr. Donovan, if you ever change your mind about that peaceful life, here's my card. She placed it on the counter beside his plate. The Bureau has special recruitment paths for veterans with your particular skill set. Mike pocketed the card without looking at it. I appreciate the offer. As Agent Calloway headed for the door, she paused and turned back. You know, when we interview victims of the desert scorpions, there's one detail that keeps coming up. They'd all say the same thing, that the gang seemed to target the vulnerable, the old, the weak, the ones who looked like they couldn't fight back. Mike met her gaze steadily. They made an assumption based on appearance. A mistake they won't make again, Agent Calloway said with a slight smile. Good night, Mr. Donovan. After she left, Mike finished his meal in silence. Darlene refilled his coffee cup without asking and patted his shoulder as she passed. You're welcome to stay as long as you like, honey, she told him. After tonight, you've got friends here. Mike nodded his thanks, feeling strangely at peace despite the violence of the evening. Tomorrow he would get back on the road, back to the solitary life he had chosen. But tonight, for the first time in years, he didn't feel quite so alone. 3 weeks had passed since the incident at the last stop diner. Mike Donovan was back on his regular route, hauling electronics from Seattle to Denver and livestock on the return trip. The bruises on his knuckles had faded to a dull yellow, and the memories of that night had begun to settle into the background of his mind. Until today. Mike pulled his rig into the Waypoint truck stop just outside of Boise, Idaho. He needed fuel, food, and a few hours of sleep before continuing his journey. As he climbed down from his cab, he noticed a group of truckers gathered near the entrance of the restaurant, talking animatedly. One of them spotted Mike and nudged his companion. "That's him," the trucker said in a voice just loud enough for Mike to hear. "That's the guy." Mike sighed. This had been happening more often lately. The story of the fat trucker who destroyed a biker gang had spread up and down the interstate like wildfire. What had started as a simple act of self-defense had grown into an almost mythical tale among the trucking community. Mike nodded politely to the group but kept walking, hoping to avoid another round of questions and congratulations. He wasn't comfortable with the attention. He hadn't been comfortable with attention since leaving the Marines. Inside the truck stop, Mike ordered a simple meal and took it to a corner table. He ate quietly, scrolling through messages on his phone. There was one from his sister in Ohio, asking if the internet stories about him were true. Another from an old Marine buddy who had somehow heard about the incident and wanted to reconnect. Mike was still deciding how to respond to these messages when a shadow fell across his table. He looked up to see an older man with a weathered face and a trucker cap standing there. "Mind if I join you?" the man asked. "Name's Earl. Been driving these routes for 32 years. Mike gestured to the empty chair across from him, and Earl sat down with a grateful nod. "I recognized you from the descriptions," Earl said, his voice low. "You're the one who took down those desert scorpions." Mike didn't deny it, but he didn't confirm it either. He simply continued eating. "I want to thank you," Earl continued. "Those bastards robbed me 6 months ago. Took my wallet, my watch, a gift from my late wife, and beat me bad enough I couldn't drive for 2 weeks. Mike set down his fork, giving Earl his full attention now. "I'm sorry that happened to you." Earl shrugged. "What's done is done. But what you did..." He shook his head in admiration. "Word is they've all pleaded guilty. Going away for a long time." "Good," Mike said simply. "You've become something of a legend, you know," Earl said with a small smile. "The story gets bigger every time I hear it. Last version had you taking on 12 bikers with chains and shotguns." Despite himself, Mike chuckled. "Impressive, considering there were only 5 of them and just 1 knife." Earl laughed. "That's how legends work. But the truth is impressive enough." His expression grew serious. "You know, since that night, there hasn't been a single report of trucker robberies anywhere on I-80. Not one." Mike hadn't known that, and the information gave him an unexpected sense of satisfaction. "The word is out," Earl continued. "Don't mess with truckers. You never know which one might be more than they appear." He stood up, extending his hand to Mike. "Anyway, just wanted to say thanks. For all of us." Mike shook the man's hand, nodding his acknowledgement. As Earl walked away, Mike returned to his meal, thinking about what the man had said. He had never wanted to be a legend or a hero. After leaving the Marines, all he had wanted was peace and anonymity. The open road, the solitude of his truck cab, the simple routine of pickup and delivery. These things had been his therapy, his way of processing the things he had seen and done during his service. Yet somehow, in trying to avoid conflict, he had become a symbol of justice in a community he had joined precisely because it allowed him to be alone with his thoughts. The irony wasn't lost on him. Mike finished his meal and paid his bill. As he walked back to his truck, several drivers nodded to him with newfound respect. Mike nodded back, accepting their silent acknowledgement. Maybe being a legend wasn't so bad, as long as he could still find peace on the long, empty stretches of highway that had become his home. And maybe, just maybe, the story of the fat trucker who taught a biker gang a painful lesson would make those highways a little safer for everyone. Mike climbed back into his rig, settled into the familiar seat, and turned the key. The powerful engine rumbled to life, ready for the road ahead.